a gun barrel pressed cold against the side of her head. The officer's flashlight, the only light on a black county road. "Deputy Marshal, you," he laughed, kicking her federal star into the gravel. He had no idea that 90 seconds from that moment, 4 unmarked SUVs would crest the hill behind him, and he would be the one face down on the asphalt, begging a woman he'd just held at gunpoint not to let her task force shoot. The dashboard clock in the unmarked grey Impala read 1:52 a.m. Deputy U.S. Marshal Vivian Cross rolled her shoulders, trying to work the stiffness out of 14 hours, parked in a surveillance position off Route 9, watching the back entrance of a warehouse that, according to 11 months of wiretaps and financial records, functioned as the East Coast distribution hub for a fentanyl and stolen goods network run by a fugitive named Julian Voss, a man who had walked out of a federal courtroom on bond 2 years earlier and simply never come back. Vivian was 38 years old, a 15-year veteran of the Marshal's service, and the first black woman to head the regional fugitive task force out of the Richmond field office. Tonight had been supposed to be the quiet tail end of a very long operation. She was exhausted in the particular bone-flattened way that came after 14 hours in a parked car, the kind of tiredness that settled into the joints rather than just the eyes. Wearing a faded charcoal hoodie over her vest, her service weapon holstered at her right hip, her star and credentials clipped inside her jacket rather than on the outside, the way she always carried them on a surveillance shift. She wanted nothing more than to get back to the safe house, sleep for 6 hours, and start the paperwork on tomorrow's warrant sweep. Copper Hollow was the kind of rural crossroads town that showed up on a map, mostly because a state highway happened to run through it 2,000 people. A shuttered feed store, and a police department of 9 officers who had, for reasons the task force had spent 14 months quietly documenting, developed an unusually consistent habit of losing interest in anything happening near the old grain warehouse on the county line. Vivian had built her career on exactly this kind of patience. She'd spent her first 5 years in the Marshal's service, working violent fugitive apprehensions in Baltimore and Detroit, and the next 10 learning that the cases that actually dismantled an organization rarely ended with a door getting kicked in on the first try. Julian Voss had been indicted once already, 3 years earlier, on a narrower set of charges that his defense team had picked apart in 11 weeks. This time, the task force had built the case around the infrastructure instead of the man, the shell companies, the transport routes, and, increasingly, the local officials who kept looking the other way with a consistency that was, statistically, almost impossible to explain as coincidence. 14 months of financial records, wiretaps, and patrol logs had narrowed the list of coincidences down to a police department that had somehow, never once, in 3 years, filed an incident report anywhere within half a mile of the way station. Parked in the deep shadow of a defunct way station just off Route 9, sat Officer Dale Prescott. Prescott was a 12-year veteran of the Copper Hollow Police Department, a man who wore his badge less like a public trust and more like a personal license. He had accumulated 9 use-of-force complaints and 2 settled civil rights lawsuits over the years, all of it quietly absorbed by a chief who had learned it was far cheaper to protect Prescott than to discipline him, a chief who, as it happened, had reasons of his own for wanting a man like Prescott patrolling that particular stretch of road at that particular hour. Prescott watched Vivian's unmarked Impala pass his hidden position and ran the plate through his onboard terminal. The screen lagged, then returned a flat, restricted code, the kind built into federal law enforcement plates, specifically to prevent local cops from stumbling into an active operation. Prescott didn't see a federal vehicle. He saw a glitch, or a plate he didn't recognize, or simply an excuse he'd already decided to use before the screen finished loading. He pulled out behind her, closing the distance fast. Vivian caught the headlights in her mirror, watched them swell too quickly, too aggressively, for a routine patrol pass. She didn't speed up. She didn't touch her brakes. She held exactly 35. Hands at 10 and 2. The lights came on. Red and blue slicing the darkness of the county road. Of course, Vivian murmured. And signaled, guiding the Impala smoothly onto the gravel shoulder. She put it in park. Rolled down all 4 windows, a habit from her earliest years in the field. A way of showing an approaching officer there was nowhere for anyone to hide, and turned on the dome light. Hands resting on top of the wheel, in her earpiece, barely more than a whisper of static. Her overwatch came online. "Boss, we've got you stopped on 9, said Deputy Marshal Theo Banks, sitting in the mobile command vehicle 2 miles back. "Want me to make a local liaison call?" "Negative." Vivian breathed, her lips barely moving. "Routine. Stop. Keep the channel open. If this guy's got a scanner, I don't want to spook anything near the warehouse." "Toppe. We're listening." In her side mirror, she watched Prescott get out of his cruiser and approach with the rolling, aggressive swagger of a man who had already made up his mind about what he was walking toward. His hand rested on his holstered weapon. He struck the trunk of her car hard with his open palm as he passed it, a tactic some officers used to leave fingerprints in case of a fled suspect. Done here with enough force to sound. In the silence of the empty road, almost like a gunshot, Vivian didn't flinch. Prescott reached her window and thrust his flashlight beam directly into her eyes. "License. Registration. Proof of insurance. No. Good evening." "Officer," Vivian said, squinting against the glare. Her voice level. "My credentials are in my breast pocket. Under my jacket. I'm also legally armed. My service weapon is on my right hip. How would you like me to proceed?" The word "armed" seemed to trip something violent and reflexive behind Prescott's eyes. He didn't hear the calm, procedural phrasing. He heard a woman in a hoodie, alone, at 2 in the morning, telling him she had a gun. "Don't move," Prescott said, his voice cracking into sudden, manufactured panic. He stepped back and drew his weapon in one fast motion, the barrel leveling at her through the open window. "Keep your hands on the wheel. You flinch. I put you down." In Vivian's ear, Banks's voice lost its professional calm. "Boss status. Do you need tactical hold?" Vivian breathed, just loud enough for the mic, though to Prescott it sounded like she was catching her breath in fear. Her pulse, if he could have measured it, sat at a steady 62. "What did you say?" Prescott barked, tapping the barrel of his gun against her window frame. "Step out. Slow. Or I swear to God." Vivian took a slow breath, letting the training settle over the anger before it could show on her face, a discipline she'd built over 15 years of exactly these moments, where the wrong flicker of expression could cost more than the wrong word. "Officer," Vivian said, her voice dropping, taking on the flat, unhurried register she used when talking a cornered fugitive down from doing something stupid. "I am an off-duty federal officer. I am going to unbuckle my seatbelt with my left hand and step out. I need you to lower your weapon. Shut your mouth and get out." She moved slowly, deliberately, and stepped into the cold night air, hands raised at shoulder height, palms open. The moment she cleared the door, Prescott slammed his forearm into her back, driving her against the side of the Impala hard enough to dent the panel. "Spread your legs," he ordered, kicking her ankles apart, jamming the gun barrel against her spine. "You are making a serious mistake." "Officer," Vivian said, her cheek pressed against the cold roof of her car. "My credentials are in my left pocket." "Yeah," Prescott sneered. "I bet they are. You people always got a story." He patted her down roughly with his free hand, found the grip of her service weapon. and ripped it from the holster with a grunt of triumph, tossing it onto the hood of the car, carrying a concealed weapon, resisting arrest, impersonating a federal officer. You're looking at real time. Sweetheart, check the left pocket. Vivian said. There was no fear in it. Only a flat, absolute certainty that seemed to enrage him further. Because she didn't sound like a victim. She sounded like his superior officer. He reached in and yanked out her leather credential case, flipping it open under his flashlight. Inside sat the heavy silver star of the United States Marshal Service. And beside it, her laminated identification, Vivian Cross, Deputy United States Marshal. For a fraction of a second, the road went completely silent. Then Prescott threw his head back and laughed a loud, ugly sound that cracked out over the empty fields. Oh, this is rich, he said, shaking his head. A Marshal, you man. I've seen some fake badges in my time. Where'd you get this? A costume shop, Officer Prescott, Vivian said, reading his name tag without turning her head, the letters catching the harsh beam of his own flashlight. If you call it in, dispatch will confirm my credential number and connect you directly to the Richmond field office. Call it in. Shut up. He shoved the credential case into his own pocket, treating it like contraband. You're not a marshal. You're some woman with a fake badge, trying to talk her way out of a gun charge. Hands behind your back. For your own sake, call it in. I said hands behind your back. Prescott roared, wrenching her left arm behind her, with enough force to strain the joint. The cuffs closed hard around her wrists. Is your body camera on? Vivian asked calmly. Prescott glanced down at his chest. The small lens sat dark. No blinking red light. He leaned in close enough that she could smell stale coffee on his breath. Must be malfunctioning, he said, with a nasty little smile. Guess it's just my word against yours out here. And around Copper Hollow. They always believe me. Vivian closed her eyes for a single, brief second, not in fear, but in something closer to exhausted pity for everyone this man had done this to before her. You have no idea what you just did, she said quietly, and meant it in a way that went well beyond the immediate threat to her own safety, meant it as a plain statement of fact about the 14 months of work now hardened into an unshakable federal record because of the last 90 seconds. I know exactly what I did, Prescott said, spinning her around and shoving her against the trunk hard enough to knock the breath from her chest. Took out the trash. He kicked her ankles wider. Keyed his radio. On the other end of that radio call sat Denise Callahan, Copper Hollow's overnight dispatcher, a 22-year civilian employee who had logged thousands of Prescott's calls over the years and had long ago learned to recognize the particular clip, self-satisfied cadence he used. Whenever he'd pulled someone over, he'd already decided was guilty. She typed the details into the log exactly as given: forged federal ID, illegal weapon, resisting the same way she'd typed 100 similar entries before. Though something about forged federal ID made her pause for half a second with her fingers over the keyboard before she kept typing anyway. Because questioning Dale Prescott's version of events had never once, in her memory, changed anything about how the night ended. Toppy. Unit 6. Need backup. Prescott looked at Vivian, cuffed and bleeding slightly at one wrist, and smiled. Negative. I've got this handled. Vivian tilted her head, listening to something beneath the crickets and the wind. You hear that? Officer Prescott, hear what? That hum. Sounds like a V8. A small, cold smile touched her mouth. Sounds like about 4 of them. Prescott turned toward the dark highway. At first there was nothing. Then he felt it before he heard it, a low vibration traveling up through the asphalt. Headlights crested the rise on Route 9. 1. Then 2. Then 4. Closing fast. moving nowhere near 35 miles an hour. 4 unmarked black SUVs came down the county road in a tight diamond formation. No sirens. Grills suddenly flooding with strobing red and blue as they closed the last stretch in seconds. Prescott stumbled back, his hand dropping toward his weapon. What the? The lead SUV didn't slow to pull over. It braked hard, angling itself to block his cruiser's exit. The second and third boxed in from either side. The fourth stopped directly in front of Vivian's Impala. Doors flew open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Federal officers, drop your weapon, drop it now. The shouts came from every direction at once, sharp and overlapping in the cold night air. As a dozen agents in tactical vests, marked U.S. Marshals poured out of the SUVs, boots hitting gravel in near-perfect unison, forming a fast, disciplined semicircle around Prescott. A constellation of red laser dots settled across his chest. Prescott froze, hand hovering uselessly over his holster. All the color gone from his face, Deputy Marshal Theo Banks stepped out of the lead vehicle. No helmet. Just a tactical vest over a dress shirt. His own badge clipped prominently to his belt. He walked straight past the paralyzed Prescott to Vivian, produced a key, and freed her wrists. The cuffs hit the gravel with a metallic clatter. She rolled her shoulders, rubbing the raw marks on her skin, and turned to face Prescott, the power in the scene having flipped with the finality of a tectonic plate snapping. She walked toward him slowly, the ring of agents parting to let her through, and stopped 2 feet away. She held out her hand. My credentials, she said softly. Prescott, hands shaking, pulled the leather case from his pocket with 2 fingers and handed it over. Vivian opened it, brushed a fleck of gravel dust off the star, and looked up at him. Looks pretty real to me, she said quietly. Agent Deputy, whatever you are. Prescott stammered, his bravado entirely gone. This is my jurisdiction. Chief Reese is going to have every one of your badges for this. Vivian gave a short, humorless laugh. Actually, Dale, I know exactly who Chief Reese is, and I know exactly why you were parked at that way station tonight. Before Prescott could respond, another set of headlights barreled down Route 9, a personal Dodge Charger, unmarked, screeching to a stop just outside the federal perimeter. Chief Walton Reese climbed out, a heavy-set man in a tailored suit rather than a uniform, marching toward the scene with the practiced fury of a man used to being obeyed. What in God's name is going on in my jurisdiction? Reese bellowed. Who authorized a federal raid on my road? Stand down. All of you. 2 agents stepped forward, blocking his path without a word. Chief Walton Reese, Vivian said, stepping into the wash of headlights, smoothing her hoodie with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment for 14 months. Every word of it planned out on nights she couldn't sleep. Right on time. We were just talking about you. Reese's face went a deep, furious red. Let my officer go. I've got the best defense attorney in this state on speed dial, and he will bury your entire task force by sunrise. You could try calling him, Vivian said, but I'd give it a minute. Bureau agents raided his downtown office about 20 minutes ago. Turns out, attorney-client privilege doesn't hold up when the attorney's been laundering money for the man you've been protecting. Reese stopped cold, every ounce of bluster drained out of him at once. Vivian pulled a folded stack of paper from her jacket and held it out. This is a federal indictment, Chief, signed by a district judge 2 hours ago. It names you, Officer Prescott, and 6 other members of your department on racketeering, obstruction, and conspiracy charges tied to Julian Voss's distribution network. We've had a wire on that way station since the spring. We know which nights your officers made themselves scarce. And we know why. Prescott, still pinned against the trunk of the Impala, let out a small, broken sound. "Chief, what is she talking about?" Vivian turned back to him, her expression finally hardening into something colder than the night air. "You thought this was a routine stop? Dali, you thought you'd caught a woman alone on a dark road you could scare into silence. We've been watching Copper Hollow PD for 14 months. We knew exactly where you'd be parked tonight, because your own chief's schedule told us. I drove past you on purpose. I needed you to put your hands on a federal officer, on a live mic, so the arrest warrants would execute the second you did." The interrogation room at the Richmond field office hummed quietly under fluorescent light at 6 the next morning. The city just beginning to catch the first grey edge of dawn outside a window none of them could see. Dale Prescott sat slumped in a metal chair in an orange jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the uniform he'd worn like armor 12 hours earlier. The door opened. Vivian walked in wearing a sharp black suit, now, her silver star hanging from a chain around her neck, and dropped a thick folder onto the table with a heavy, deliberate sound. Prescott flinched, but didn't look up. "Here's how this works, Dali," Vivian said, pulling out a chair. "Your union isn't coming. Chief Reese is 2 cells down, offering up every dirty cop in 3 counties to save himself. And the lawyer you were counting on is currently negotiating his own plea on wire fraud. I was just doing my job." Prescott mumbled. "Your job was to protect and serve," Vivian said evenly. "Instead, you were armed muscle for Julian Voss." At the name, Prescott's head snapped up, eyes wide. "We know Voss paid Reese." Vivian continued, opening the folder to reveal surveillance photographs. "We know Reese had officers like you run interference, intimidate anyone who got too close to that warehouse, and falsify reports when federal plates showed up on the county line. We know you used your badge as a weapon to protect a criminal enterprise, Dali. And tonight, you used it to point a gun at the woman who'd spent 14 months building the case that was going to end it." She leaned forward. "Voss was arrested on a private airstrip in West Virginia an hour ago. It's over." Prescott stared at the photographs, the full weight of it finally landing, and lowered his face into his cuffed hands. Vivian stood, gathering the folder. "You wanted to know if my badge was real, Officer Prescott." She paused at the door, looking back. "You're about to find out exactly how real it is for the next 20 years. The federal case against Copper Hollow's police department moved with the speed reserved for corruption that had already been documented in exhaustive, wiretap detail for over a year. Within a week, the FBI's forensic accountants had traced 18 months of unexplained deposits into accounts belonging to Chief Reese, 3 sergeants, and in the account that finally broke the department's silence, a shell company registered to Reese's brother-in-law that had received over $400,000 in consulting fees from a logistics firm that turned out to be one of Julian Voss's fronts. Deputy Marshal Theo Banks sat in on the formal interview when Prescott, 3 days into his federal detention, finally agreed to talk without his union rep present. "You put a gun on a federal officer's spine," the FBI investigator across the table said, sliding a still frame from Banks's body camera across the table, the moment the cuffs had come off Vivian's wrists. "Walk me through why a 12-year veteran doesn't run a name before doing that." "I'd already decided what she was," Prescott said quietly, staring at the table. "The second I saw her, a hoodie, an old car, alone at 2 in the morning. Nothing she said after that was going to change my mind. Not even the badge in my own pocket. That's the most honest thing you've said since we picked you up." The investigator replied, and closed the folder. The financial trail took longer to untangle than the confession had, but it told a more complete story. Forensic accountants working with Vivian's task force spent the better part of 2 weeks reconstructing the flow of money from Voss's distribution network, through a chain of shell entities that ultimately deposited into personal accounts belonging not just to Chief Reese, but to 3 of his sergeants and, in one case, directly into a joint account Prescott shared with his wife, $11,000 over 18 months, logged internally as overtime differential for shifts that department records showed he had never actually worked. He wasn't even being subtle about it. Deputy Marshal Banks noted during a case review, sliding a printed ledger across the conference table to Vivian, fake overtime slips signed off by his own sergeant. Nobody above him ever asked why a small-town patrol officer was clearing $60,000 a year in overtime on a department budget that couldn't afford new radios. Nobody wanted to ask. Vivian said, "That's usually how it works. The people who could have asked were the ones getting paid not to." Down the hall, a second team of investigators sat with Marisol Ferrer, a Copper Hollow resident who had reported her own car searched at gunpoint 11 months earlier after driving too close to the way station on her way home from a night shift. A complaint that had gone nowhere because the department's own internal review board consisted of exactly the officers she was complaining about. I filed it with the state police instead, because I didn't trust anyone in that building. Ferrer told them. Nobody ever called me back. I figured that was the end of it. It's not anymore. The lead investigator said, "Your complaint is Exhibit 14 in the federal indictment. It's the reason we can show this wasn't one bad night. It was a pattern. And you were the first person brave enough to write it down." Chief Reese, questioned separately, tried at first to claim the payments from Voss's shell company were legitimate consulting income for off-duty security work, an explanation that collapsed within an hour once investigators produced text messages between Reese and Voss's operations manager discussing, in explicit terms, which nights officers should be reassigned away from the way station and which drivers on Route 9 warranted special attention. Reese's own plea negotiation, held 2 weeks later in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's office, was a considerably less dignified affair than the swagger he'd walked in with on Route 9. His attorney, a well-dressed man who specialized in white-collar defense and clearly regretted taking the call, spent most of the meeting trying to negotiate the difference between 15 years and 20, while Reese sat silently picking at the cuff of his jail-issued jumpsuit, occasionally muttering that Voss had promised him the payments would never be traceable. He told me his people handled the paperwork. Reese said at one point, to no one, in particular, said it was clean. Nothing about laundering $400,000 through a logistics shell company is clean. Chief, Simon Okoye replied without looking up from his notes. He told you what he needed you to believe, so you'd keep doing what he needed you to do. That's not a defense. That's a description of exactly how this kind of arrangement works every time. Reese ultimately pleaded guilty to racketeering and conspiracy charges, accepting a sentence of 18 years in exchange for testimony that helped federal prosecutors trace 2 additional Voss-linked shell companies operating in neighboring counties. A cooperation that did nothing to soften his own sentence, but considerably widened the scope of the broader investigation into the trafficking network he'd spent years protecting. The fallout in Copper Hollow itself unfolded with the particular, disorienting speed of a town watching its own government dissolve on live television. Within 72 hours of the indictment, the state's Department of Criminal Justice Services suspended Copper Hollow PD's certification pending federal review, and the county sheriff's department was directed to assume emergency patrol responsibilities for the town's roads. Mayor Constance Whitlow, who had spent 6 years quietly enjoying a police department that never generated budget complaints because it apparently didn't need much beyond what Voss's network was funneling into it, called a hastily arranged town meeting in the elementary school gymnasium that drew nearly 400 of the town's 2,000 residents. I want to be clear that this administration had no knowledge of what Chief Reese was doing, Whitlow told the crowd, her voice shaking under the fluorescent gym lights, before a resident in the 3rd row stood up and asked, loudly enough for the local news cameras to catch every word, Why the town's police budget had shown a suspicious surplus for 6 straight years, if nobody in the building had ever asked a single question about where the extra money was coming from. Whitlow did not have an answer that satisfied the room. And by the following week, federal prosecutors had quietly informed her office that her own financial disclosures were under preliminary review as well. A fact that ended her re-election campaign before it had properly begun. Denise Callahan, the overnight dispatcher who had logged Prescott's radio call without ever quite believing the words she was typing, turned over 18 months of her own dispatch logs to investigators, unprompted the week after the indictment came down, along with a handwritten list kept privately. In a notebook, she'd never shown a single supervisor of every call she'd found suspicious enough to remember without being asked. It became, in the prosecutor's own words during a later filing, one of the single most useful pieces of documentary evidence in establishing the pattern across the whole department. Precisely because nobody had ever told her to keep it, and she had done it anyway. Marisol Ferrer, whose 11-month-old complaint had sat untouched in a filing cabinet the entire time, found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, invited to speak at the same town meeting. She stood at the microphone for a long moment before she spoke. I called the non-emergency line the week it happened. She told the room. I gave a description, a badge number, a time. Nobody ever called me back. And I told myself that was just how it worked out here. That people like me didn't get taken seriously by people like them. I want everyone in this room to understand that it wasn't that nobody heard me. It's that the people I reported it to were the people I was reporting. The room was silent for a long moment before the applause started. Uncertain at first, then steady. 6 months later, in a federal courtroom 200 miles from Copper Hollow, Dale Prescott stood for sentencing on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, assault on a federal officer, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The gallery held reporters, task force colleagues, and, in the second row, Marisol Ferrer, whose 11-month-old complaint had finally been read into the federal record as proof of a pattern rather than dismissed as an isolated grievance. Prescott's court-appointed defense attorney, a weary public defender named Carl Denning, who had inherited the case only after the union-funded lawyer withdrew rather than be associated with a RICO indictment, made the argument he had, in fairness, made countless times for countless clients that his client had panicked under the stress of a nighttime stop, that no shots were fired, that 12 years of service should count for something even in the face of what the video showed. My client made a terrible decision in a matter of seconds. Denning told the court, he is not the architect of what happened in this town. He is, in many ways, a product of a department that trained him to see suspicion first and facts second, and never once corrected him when that instinct went too far. That may well be true. Mr. Denning. Judge Alicia Marsh replied no relation to anyone in the case. Simply a name the file clerks had joked about for weeks, and it is precisely why this court intends to sentence the department's culture as thoroughly as it sentences your client. Within the limits the law allows me. A man who is never corrected for 12 years does not become dangerous by accident. He becomes dangerous because an entire structure around him decided it was cheaper not to look. The federal prosecutor, a measured man named Simon Okoye, who had built the case alongside Vivian's task force for over a year, addressed the court before sentencing. Your Honor, it would be easy to treat this as one officer's terrible split-second decision on a dark road, but the evidence shows something far more durable. Ferrer reported an armed search 11 months before this incident and was ignored. Because for years, nothing about how this department operated gave anyone reason to believe a complaint would matter. What changed was not the defendant's judgment. It was the fact that the woman he finally chose to threaten happened to be the one person in the state with the resources to make sure it was heard. Vivian submitted a written statement rather than testify in person. which the prosecutor read into the record, that the true cost of a badge wielded as a weapon was never contained to the person threatened in the moment, that it radiated outward into every resident who had quietly decided reporting wasn't worth the risk, and that real accountability meant asking not what happened to the one officer caught on a federal wire, but whether the department around him had been built in a way that made men like him inevitable. The judge did not need long to reach a sentence. You held her credentials in your own hand. "Mr. Prescott," she said, and you laughed, because looking at them honestly would have meant admitting you were wrong about her before she said a word. That choice did not just end your career. It was the final piece of evidence that brought down an entire department that had spent years protecting a criminal enterprise instead of the people who lived beside it. "I sentence you to 22 years in federal prison." Prescott did not look back at the gallery as marshals led him out. Julian Voss himself pleaded guilty, 8 months later, to a sprawling indictment covering drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to bribe public officials across 3 states. Accepting a sentence of 31 years after his own attorneys concluded that the wiretap evidence Vivian's task force had assembled left essentially nothing to contest at trial. The warehouse on the county line was seized under federal asset forfeiture and later sold at auction to a regional agricultural co-op. Its loading dock now used for grain trucks instead of the shipments that had quietly funded a police department's silence for the better part of 6 years. On a clear morning the following spring, Deputy U.S. Marshal Vivian Cross drove her Impala down Route 9, one last time, past the old way station, now boarded up and marked with a state police notice, rather than anything belonging to Copper Hollow PD, which had been dissolved and folded into the county sheriff's department under a federal consent decree. There were no lights in her mirror. There was only the long grey road ahead, the fields just beginning to green at the edges, and the quiet, unhurried satisfaction of a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to prove exactly what she was. She thought about the 14 months of parked cars and cold coffee that had led to that single 90-second stretch on the shoulder of Route 9, and about how close the entire case had come to unraveling if she'd reacted to Prescott the way her body had, for one instinctive half-second, wanted her to react with her training, telling her exactly how fast she could have disarmed him before he ever got the cuffs on. She had let it happen anyway, because the case needed the violation on the record more than it needed her pride intact, and because she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moment in any operation wasn't the one where you were afraid. It was the one where being right felt more urgent than being patient. She thought, too, about Marisol Ferrer's voice in that gymnasium, steady and unhurried in front of 400 of her own neighbors, and about how rarely the people who did the hardest, quietest work of holding a system accountable ever got a room willing to actually listen. Vivian had spent 14 months building a case. Nobody outside a handful of federal offices would ever fully understand the shape of, and in the end it had taken one dispatcher's private notebook and one resident's unanswered phone call to make the whole thing land the way it needed to. That, she thought, was usually how it worked. Not one dramatic night on a dark road, but everything quiet that came before it. She thought about the 14 hours of surveillance that had led to that single stretch of road, and drove on, unhurried, the fields opening out ahead of her under a wide grey sky. If a story like this reminds you why accountability matters, hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes no badge should be above the law. And subscribe for more true-to-life stories of justice finally catching up. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Deputy Marshal Cross's position?